The Supreme Court chamber had heard 1,000 voices, but this one was different. The name Denzel Washington on the docket had drawn skepticism, curiosity, and more than a few raised eyebrows. Tourists lined the marble steps of the nation's highest court, whispering as if entering a theater instead of a constitutional arena. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Press badges were out, court sketch artists double-checking pencil strokes. Every seat was filled, not just by lawyers and reporters, but by those who didn't usually show up to watch amicus briefs. They were here for a show. But Denzel wasn't performing. He stood at the podium wearing a dark gray suit, no pin, no pretense. His face was still, his hands flat on the oak surface, steady as stone. He didn't glance at the cameras. He didn't wave to the gallery. He had waited 6 years for this moment, and more than anyone in that chamber realized, he'd earned it. Behind him, in rows of rich red leather and gold-trimmed curtains, the justices sat in silence. At the center, Chief Justice John Roberts leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. On paper, this hearing was procedural, an amicus argument on a contentious civil liberties case. But everyone knew it was more. This was a test, and not just of law. Roberts broke the silence first. "Mr. Washington," he began, voice level but clipped, "you are here today not as a petitioner, not as a respondent, but as a friend of the court. That status is traditionally granted to those with relevant expertise. Tell us, what exactly qualifies you to advise this bench?" A low murmur passed through the gallery. Several reporters perked up. The question wasn't entirely inappropriate, but it was pointed, personal, the kind meant to knock someone off balance. Denzel didn't flinch. He looked directly at the Chief Justice. "Respectfully, sir," he began, his voice calm and unshaken, "the Constitution does not limit insight to title. I come here not to perform, but to present an argument, backed by precedent, by principle, and by the very text you swore to uphold." He paused, not for drama, but for breath. "And if credentials are in question, I have a JD from Howard University, highest honors. I clerked in New York's 2nd District under Judge Hamilton. I've worked pro bono on over 30 civil cases, 10 of which involved the very statute we are discussing today." He held Roberts's gaze. A ripple went through the room. He hadn't just come prepared, he'd come armed. Roberts's eyebrows lifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but said nothing. Not yet. Denzel continued, "This isn't about me. This is about Raymond Keller, a 67-year-old Vietnam veteran whose house was seized after his grandson was caught selling cannabis from the front steps. No charges were filed against Mr. Keller, no trial, no notice, just a letter in the mail and a chain across his front door." He reached down, lifted a manila folder, and held it with both hands. Inside this file is the government's justification. One paragraph citing a forfeiture statute from 1984. That statute has been reinterpreted repeatedly in ways that contradict its original intent. I'm here to argue that the seizure violated both the Due Process Clause and the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. He paused again. "If the state can take your home without proof, without process, and without punishment, then property rights are not protected by law. They are granted by permission." From the far left of the bench, Justice Sonia Sotomayor leaned forward slightly. Justice Elena Kagan reached for a pen. Even Justice Clarence Thomas, often silent during arguments, tilted his head in interest. Only Roberts remained still. And then, with the sharp edge of a blade hidden behind a lawyer's tone, he asked, "Mr. Washington, do you truly believe you understand this court's jurisprudence well enough to challenge how we've interpreted civil forfeiture for the last 40 years? A pause. He'd said it softly, but it landed like a punch. The implication was clear. You are not one of us. The room went silent again, and for the first time, Denzel smiled. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't for the crowd. It was the kind of smile someone gives right before they start flipping over a chessboard. I do, he said, because I've read every forfeiture ruling by this court from 1983 to 2024, every majority opinion, every dissent, every footnote, including Bennis v. Michigan, Austin v. United States, Timms v. Indiana, and your own opinion in United States v. Alvarez. Page 17, paragraph 4, you wrote, "Liberty requires not only the protection of the innocent, but the restraint of the powerful. I believe this case tests that principle, and I believe your own words support my position." You could feel the oxygen shift in the room. Somewhere in the back, a reporter dropped her pen. Denzel wasn't bluffing, he wasn't winging it. He was citing the Chief Justice's own ruling, accurately, confidently, and without notes. Roberts opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. He reached for the opinion binder in front of him, and for the first time that morning, he looked unsure. 3 months earlier, when the name Washington Denzel first appeared in the amicus docket for United States v. Carson, most in the legal community assumed it was a stunt, a publicity play, another celebrity inserting themselves into a policy debate without understanding the stakes. In law firms across K Street, partners chuckled. In federal agencies, clerks raised eyebrows. A former prosecutor at the DOJ tweeted, "This should be interesting. Let's hope he memorizes more than just lines this time." What none of them knew, not then, was that Denzel Washington had spent the last 6 years preparing for this exact moment. It had started quietly. A night class at Howard Law, then another, a semester off from acting, a full course load, study groups where no one believed he'd actually show. Professors whispered his name in the faculty lounge, but in the classroom, he was just Mr. Washington, the student who always sat near the back, took his notes by hand, and asked the questions no one else did. He didn't ask for special treatment. He never missed a reading, and he never once mentioned who he was. By the time he graduated, summa cum laude, his professors didn't talk about the actor. They talked about the scholar, the guy who had traced the evolution of civil forfeiture from colonial admiralty law through post-9/11 enforcement policy, the guy who had written a 90-page independent research paper connecting the Fifth Amendment to modern asset seizure loopholes. It was that paper that got the attention of the ACLU's litigation director, and it was that paper, expanded, revised, footnoted with brutal precision, that became the 42-page amicus brief in Carson. When news broke that the Supreme Court had granted Washington 10 minutes of oral argument time, legal Twitter exploded. "A celebrity at the lectern?" one commentator sneered. "What's next, Supreme Court idol?" But the law professors stayed quiet. They'd seen the brief, and they knew something the pundits didn't. It was airtight. Meanwhile, inside Denzel's modest home office in Northwest DC, the lights stayed on late. He practiced arguments in front of a mirror, rehearsed answers with former clerks, printed out every relevant case since 1800, and color-coded them by doctrinal category. He didn't want applause. He wanted to be ready. And he wasn't just preparing for the court. He was preparing for Roberts. Denzel had studied his style, the surgical questions, the Socratic traps, the calm but often loaded phrasing. He knew Roberts loved to corner unprepared lawyers by citing obscure 19th century decisions and asking impossible hypotheticals. So Denzel found every Roberts opinion on forfeiture, due process, and takings. He created flashcards. He cross-referenced citations. He even made a spreadsheet, color-coded by how often Roberts agreed with Scalia, Thomas, or Kagan on property rights cases. No one outside his inner circle saw it. But inside his head, Denzel wasn't an actor anymore. He was a litigator, building a scaffold of facts and precedent with the precision of a master craftsman. 10 days before the hearing, a reporter from The Atlantic called his publicist. "We heard he's filing an amicus, just looking for comment." The response was short. "Mr. Washington is not available for interviews. He's preparing for court." That was it. And yet, behind closed doors in legal circles, the whispers grew louder. Some said he was just rehearsing like it was a role. Others, those who had read his work, weren't so sure. A Yale law professor, quoted anonymously, said, "I disagree with some of his conclusions, but I can't deny the rigor. This isn't celebrity lawyering. This is originalist firepower." By the time the day of oral argument arrived, things had shifted. Reporters were lined up on First Street by 6 a.m. Law students from Georgetown and GWU skipped class just to sit in the overflow room. And in the U.S. Solicitor General's office, the tone had changed from amusement to caution. "This guy's not playing," one deputy said, reviewing the amicus again. "If the justices give him time, real time, we could be looking at a narrative shift we can't control." Back in the court, after Denzel's powerful opening and sharp rebuttal to Roberts' first challenge, the atmosphere had changed. The early smirks had faded, laptops tapped faster, pens scratched harder, and at counsel's table, the government's attorney, Assistant Solicitor General Janice Keeling, flipped through her binder more nervously than usual. She had prepped hard too, but she hadn't expected this. She looked up once. Denzel was still standing at the lectern, posture straight, hands at rest, eyes focused only on the bench. No script, no teleprompter, just the Constitution, and the confidence that came from living every page of it for 6 long years. By the time he cited Madison's letters to Jefferson, quoting the 1788 line about double violence against the sacred right of property, even Chief Justice Roberts had stopped looking at Denzel like a guest. He was looking at him like a colleague, a sharp one. There's a moment in every Supreme Court argument when the bench shifts, not physically, but mentally, when the justices move from testing the advocate to learning from them, when the questions stop trying to poke holes and start probing the edges of a new idea. In Courtroom 1 of the United States Supreme Court, that moment came exactly 12 minutes into Denzel Washington's argument. It started with Justice Elena Kagan. "Mr. Washington," she said, leaning slightly forward, "you've just cited the 1795 Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling in Commonwealth v. Bennington. That's a case we've rarely seen raised in recent forfeiture arguments. Can you elaborate on how that ruling applies to the Fifth Amendment's takings clause in the modern context?" Denzel didn't hesitate. "Yes, Justice Kagan," he replied. "In Bennington, the state attempted to confiscate the land of a Quaker who refused to serve in the militia. The court ruled that such seizure, despite political tensions, violated the colony's charter protections for private property. That charter, in turn, became a model for several early state constitutions. It draws a direct through line between colonial resistance to arbitrary seizure and the language of the federal Fifth Amendment." A pause. A pencil tapped on a legal pad. Kagan nodded once. Across the bench, Justice Neil Gorsuch glanced toward his law clerk. Then came Justice Amy Coney Barrett. "Mr. Washington, your brief mentions that current civil forfeiture law is functionally inverted from its historical roots. Can you explain what you meant by that?" "Certainly," Denzel said, steady. "Civil forfeiture originated in admiralty law, where courts had no way to prosecute the ship owners because they were often foreign or untraceable. So the ship itself became the defendant. This made sense when dealing with piracy or illegal trade on the high seas." He paused for emphasis. "But that logic doesn't translate to domestic property seizures. In 1789, we didn't take Barnes because someone sold whiskey out back. We arrested the person if we had proof. Today, we seize homes, bank accounts, and vehicles without charges. The government has flipped the burden. We've gone from innocent until proven guilty to prove you didn't know what someone else did. The courtroom remained silent, not out of disrespect, but because nobody wanted to miss a word. Justice Clarence Thomas, famously quiet during oral arguments, shifted forward, slowly. Then, in a voice that reporters hadn't heard in months, he spoke. Mr. Washington, in your brief, you propose a return to the original understanding of property rights under the Fifth Amendment. Do you believe Bennis v. Michigan was wrongly decided? There it was, a direct challenge to precedent. Denzel took a beat. Not long, just long enough to be thoughtful without looking hesitant. Yes, Justice Thomas, I do, and not just on policy grounds, but on constitutional ones. The forfeiture in Bennis involved an innocent spouse who lost her car because her husband used it without her knowledge. The court upheld that taking, but I believe, and I argue, that the Fifth Amendment, understood through the lens of Madison and Blackstone, requires both a public purpose and proportional justice. He looked directly at the bench, and I'd argue Bennis failed both. Thomas didn't nod, but he didn't frown either. He just scribbled something into his notes. Back at the lectern, Denzel felt the shift. He wasn't defending his credentials anymore. He wasn't the actor. He was now the advocate. Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned in next. Mr. Washington, you've laid out a compelling historical narrative. But what's your limiting principle? If we roll back civil forfeiture laws as you suggest, are we handcuffing law enforcement entirely? A fair question, a tough one. But Denzel was ready. I'm not asking this court to eliminate civil forfeiture. I'm asking it to recalibrate. Return it to what it was, a tool used when prosecution isn't possible, not when it's merely inconvenient. He gestured slightly with his hand, not dramatic, but firm. In my proposed framework, 3 conditions must be met. 1. A substantial connection between the property and the crime. 2. Clear and convincing evidence that the owner had knowledge or willful blindness. 3. The forfeiture must serve a specific public use, not just general fund revenue. A murmur of approval passed through the press section. One reporter whispered to another, "That's a test. That's an actual judicial test." And that's when Chief Justice Roberts leaned back in his chair, fingers folded. He didn't interrupt again. He just watched. By the time Denzel Washington stepped down from the lectern, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from skepticism to reverence. Justice Sotomayor had leaned over to whisper something to Kagan. Chief Justice Roberts sat motionless, brows pinched in thought, no longer the architect of a trap, but a man calculating how to climb out of one. But while silence reigned inside the court, the world outside was on fire. At exactly 10:52 a.m., a legal blogger inside the chamber tweeted, "Denzel Washington just cited Commonwealth v. Bennington in real time, from memory, and he's absolutely right." That tweet hit 20,000 likes before he'd even left the courtroom. By 11:15 a.m., CNN was breaking into regular coverage. Denzel Washington stuns SCOTUS with legal mastery. Justices appear genuinely moved. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, a 2L at UCLA Law stopped mid-class to whisper to her friend, "You need to see this. He just quoted Madison's letters." At Georgetown, professors suspended a scheduled property law lecture to stream the live recap. The Washington Post's legal beat headline would read, "From movie star to legal star, Washington rewrites the courtroom script." But the outside buzz wasn't just about style. It was about substance. Washington's argument hadn't been clever. It had been thorough, grounded, impeccably sourced. And his 3-part test, connection, knowledge, purpose, began circulating among legal circles like wildfire. In the DOJ press wing, Assistant Solicitor General Keeling reviewed her notes for the upcoming rebuttal. Her palms were damp. She'd prepped for this argument like every other, controlled, strategic, clinical. But this wasn't clinical. This was poetic, and that made it dangerous. Meanwhile, in a quiet brownstone office in Northwest D.C., Professor Marcus Hill, Washington's former constitutional law professor, sat at his desk, watching the transcript update line by line. He sipped his tea, smiled softly, and said to no one, "He found his courtroom." Hill had always known there was more to Denzel than performance. He remembered the night Denzel had stayed after a 3-hour seminar to ask if Barron v. Baltimore really aligned with Madison's intention on federal constraints. Not many students even knew that case. Fewer challenged it. Only one had done both. That night, the networks ran primetime segments. MSNBC opened with, "This isn't just a celebrity trying to be smart. This is a smart man who stayed quiet until he was ready." Fox News' legal analysts said, "We may disagree with his policy conclusions, but legally, that argument was impressive." Even Justice Thomas's former clerk tweeted, "You don't have to agree with Denzel Washington's conclusions, but you better respect how he got there." That was originalism with teeth. At a cafe near DuPont Circle, a group of young public defenders watched the highlights replayed on a loop. One of them, a woman who'd lost 3 forfeiture cases in the last year, whispered, "He said everything we've been trying to scream for years, but now they heard it." Back inside the court, Roberts rubbed his forehead in silence. This wasn't how the day was supposed to go. He'd expected a spectacle, maybe even a mistake to cite in law school textbooks. Instead, he got a doctrinal framework, a constitutional test, a memory sharp enough to quote state-level decisions from 1821. He looked across the bench. Thomas had been taking notes the entire time. Barrett had asked thoughtful follow-ups. Kavanaugh was openly intrigued. Even Alito hadn't scowled. Roberts knew how these things worked. He couldn't walk back his initial tone, but he could do something else. He could write the opinion himself, not out of ego, but to own the moment, to correct it, and to signal that the court was not above evolution, even when that evolution was sparked by someone it didn't expect. The closing gavel hadn't even fallen, but the real case had already begun. Not Carson v. United States. Not really. This was assumption v. excellence. And for the first time in decades, the public was watching oral argument like it was the Super Bowl. And Denzel Washington? He wasn't the halftime show. He was the game. The courtroom had cleared, but the real deliberation had only just begun. Behind the heavy oak doors of the Supreme Court's inner chambers, the 9 justices dispersed to their private offices, the weight of Denzel Washington's argument echoing more heavily than anyone had expected. Even Justice Thomas, famously reserved, closed his notebook slowly and muttered, "That may be the most complete originalist argument I've heard in 5 years." In his chambers, Chief Justice Roberts sat at his desk, a yellow legal pad in front of him, and a thick silence around. He'd planned to assign the majority opinion to Justice Gorsuch, or perhaps Kavanaugh, but now it had to be him. Not for control, not for optics, but because he had made the mistake. He had underestimated a man based on profession, not preparation. And now he had the chance to write the kind of opinion that didn't just clarify law, it corrected history. He clicked his pen and wrote at the top of the page, "Opinion of the Court, Henderson versus United States." Meanwhile, in an apartment in Shaw, Washington, D.C., Denzel Washington stood alone at the window, a mug of black coffee in his hand, watching the city settle into dusk. He wasn't thinking about cameras or hashtags. He was thinking about a basement seminar room at Howard, where Professor Hill had once told him, "One day, you won't be reading opinions, you'll be influencing them." That day had arrived, and he wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he had earned it. 2 days later, law clerks across the court were buzzing. Roberts had assigned himself the majority opinion. That almost never happened in politically charged forfeiture cases, but this time it made sense. The Chief Justice wasn't writing to defend precedent. He was writing to reshape it, with help from an amicus brief drafted by someone the court hadn't expected to take seriously. Justice Barrett was the first to send in edits. She suggested a paragraph that acknowledged Washington's unique textual analysis of Madison's letter, yes, the one he'd personally copied from the Library of Congress. Justice Kagan proposed including a line about how intellectual contribution can come from any credentialed path. Justice Thomas, in an unusual move, requested a concurrence, one that would go even further than the majority opinion. Inside the DOJ, a quiet panic took hold. If the court sided with Washington, entire civil forfeiture programs would need restructuring. State legislatures would scramble. Agencies would lose hundreds of millions in yearly revenue. But no one wanted to challenge the reasoning directly, because the truth was, Washington hadn't just offered a compelling opinion, he had given them no way out. And so, the draft grew. Pages filled with citations from Washington's brief, his oral argument, even historical court rulings no one had mentioned in over a century. It was no longer about who had delivered the message. It was about what had been said and how thoroughly it had been proven. Back in Denzel's apartment, the phone buzzed. It was Professor Hill. "I've read early clerk chatter," Hill said. "You did more than make history. You gave the court a map, and they're using it." Denzel exhaled, slow and steady. "Good," he said simply. "Now," Hill added, "let's see if they follow it all the way to the end." And just a few blocks away, Chief Justice Roberts sat back in his chair, pen finally down, the final line written. He reread it once more. This case reminds us that insight is not the sole domain of any one profession, and that in the hands of the prepared, the law does not discriminate between the actor and the advocate. He didn't smile, but he felt something close, a reckoning, and perhaps a redemption. It was a gray morning in D.C., outside the Supreme Court. Reporters stood in light drizzle, huddled under umbrellas, holding coffee in one hand, microphones in the other. They weren't here for a criminal verdict, a scandal, or a leaked opinion. They were here because something unprecedented was about to happen. A ruling that had begun with a condescending question and ended with a legal awakening. At 10:01 a.m., the clerk stepped out, holding the envelope. Inside Courtroom 1, a handful of spectators leaned forward. Denzel wasn't among them. He sat quietly in a side room near the back, unseen, unbothered. This wasn't about spectacle anymore. It was about justice. The clerk read aloud. "In the matter of Henderson versus United States, the court rules in favor of the petitioners." Gasps, then silence. Chief Justice John Roberts himself began reading the majority opinion. His voice was steady, measured, but behind each word, a quiet sense of reflection. Civil forfeiture, as currently practiced, has expanded beyond its constitutional boundaries. The founders understood private property to be not merely physical space, but a shield against unchecked state power. He paused, then continued. The test articulated in the amicus brief of Mr. Washington provides a clear and historically grounded framework for evaluating such seizures. Three-part test. Madison's letters, the double violence quote, all of it now part of U.S. jurisprudence. Justice Thomas issued a concurring opinion going further. He called for a reevaluation of every civil forfeiture doctrine that permits the state to act before proving guilt. Justice Sotomayor's concurrence addressed equity. These laws have been used disproportionately against the poor and marginalized. That changes today. Justice Kagan's note was brief but powerful. Scholarship can wear many faces. This court is wiser for having listened. By noon, every major legal podcast had pushed out an emergency episode. By 2 p.m., the opinion had been downloaded 1.4 million times. By 3 p.m., the White House issued a statement commending the court for reinforcing constitutional guardrails around individual liberty. CNN ran a banner, "Washington changes the law," and the narrative. Fox News' legal panel was divided. Some called it dangerous limitation on police tools, while others admitted the historical analysis was bulletproof. Even MSNBC's Rachel Maddow broke script. We just witnessed the Supreme Court adopt the legal theory of an actor because that actor studied harder than most law school deans. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the city at the center of Henderson, community leaders gathered outside the seized center. The locks were being cut. A small child, maybe 6 years old, asked his mother what was happening. She bent down and whispered, "We're getting our place back." Back in Denzel's apartment, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Text messages, emails, calls from law professors, senators, former co-stars. He ignored most of them. Instead, he turned to the window again, watching the Capitol fade behind clouded glass. "I didn't do it for headlines," he murmured. "I did it so they wouldn't ignore the next voice." That night, the New York Times ran the headline, "The Courtroom Performance That Changed the Constitution," and below, a single photo. Denzel Washington, outside the court, trench coat on, eyes forward, walking away, not toward a podium, but into history. In the days following the Supreme Court's ruling, something unusual happened across the legal world. Not just headlines, not just commentary, but actual change. At law schools from Howard to Harvard, professors adjusted their syllabi. One section was suddenly on every required reading list. Washington's argument, Henderson v. United States, transcript excerpt and analysis. Students, many of whom had only seen Denzel on screen, now highlighted his footnotes and dissected his rhetorical structure. One second-year student at Yale wrote in her journal, "He didn't just win a case, he taught a generation how to dismantle power with history." At UCLA, a constitutional law professor paused mid-lecture. "Let me be clear," he said, gesturing toward the slide showing a passage from the majority opinion. "This isn't just good lawyering. This is what happens when someone refuses to be boxed in by expectation." The American Bar Association invited Washington to deliver the keynote at their annual convention. He declined. Instead, he offered a single recorded statement. "I didn't come here to be honored. I came to remind you the law was never meant to be inaccessible." At major firms, a quiet discomfort grew. Dozens of seasoned partners reread Washington's brief in disbelief. How had he stitched together centuries of precedent with such precision? Some grumbled that his fame gave him access. Others admitted what they didn't want to say out loud. He worked harder than we did. Podcast after podcast dedicated episodes. The Actor Who Changed Jurisprudence. Denzel versus Doctrine. How One Brief Redefined Civil Forfeiture. Clips of his oral argument went viral on TikTok, especially the part where he quoted Madison's double violence line. A new generation was watching, not for drama, but for strategy. Applications to Howard Law spiked 58% in the next admissions cycle. Young black students in particular listed one reason for applying: "Because I saw someone who looked like me speak truth to the court and win." At high schools across the country, civics teachers told the story. Some played audio reenactments, some assigned essays. One 10th grade teacher in Detroit asked her students, "Why do you think they listened to him in the end?" One student replied, "Because he knew more than they thought he should." At a small courthouse in Georgia, Judge Valerie Lopez kept a framed quote on her desk after the ruling. "Legal wisdom can come from unexpected sources." Roberts, 2025. She had been mistaken for a court clerk 3 times that week, but she didn't correct them anymore. She just waited for her turn on the bench. And yet, through all the celebration, Denzel Washington remained silent. No press tour, no speaking circuit. He returned to the same quiet apartment surrounded by casebooks and letters, legal pads, and black coffee. When asked by a friend why he hadn't capitalized on the attention, he smiled. Because the attention was never the goal. The change was. In one final act, he did make a call. To a small community foundation in Philadelphia, he funded the full renovation of the seized community center from the Henderson case under one condition: no plaques, no dedications, just reopen the doors. On the day it reopened, a child ran through the front gate, holding a basketball under one arm and a library card in the other. Inside the entryway, a quote etched in brass: "Liberty depends on reason, not reputation. D. Washington." It had been 6 months since the Supreme Court handed down its landmark decision in Henderson v. United States, and yet the echoes hadn't faded. They had crystallized. In legal circles, the Washington test became shorthand for constitutional restraint in civil forfeiture cases. Law reviews published entire volumes analyzing his brief. Law students across the country cited his argument in moot court competitions. A Harvard professor said during a panel, "He didn't just reshape doctrine. He reminded us that intellectual authority isn't owned, it's earned." A new constitutional law casebook listed Henderson among the top 10 modern decisions. The author wrote in the preface, "This case didn't just teach legal doctrine, it taught humility." And then something happened no one expected. The Federal Judicial Center launched a seminar titled "Reimagining Expertise: The Washington Framework." Denzel wasn't invited to teach it. He was invited to help design it. He accepted on one condition: no celebrity framing. We talk precedent. We talk process. We teach the next generation how to out-research the institutions that overlook them. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, his agent called with news of 3 new film offers. He turned them all down, not out of protest, not out of exhaustion, but because he had a different stage now. The Washington Justice Initiative opened its doors that fall, offering legal aid to victims of unconstitutional property seizures. Its walls weren't lined with photos of courtroom drama or media praise. They were covered with handwritten notes from communities. "You got my dad's bakery back. We reopened our shelter. They said we didn't have a case. You showed them otherwise." At the first volunteer orientation, Denzel stood quietly at the front of the room, holding a manila folder. No speech, just a question. "Who here is ready to work harder than anyone expects you to?" 20 hands shot up. That was enough. In his only public interview since the ruling, he was asked, "Why didn't you do more media after the decision? You could have been the face of legal reform." He smiled. "Because the law already has enough faces. What it needs are more footnotes." 1 year to the day after the ruling, Chief Justice Roberts stood at a Georgetown law event. He held a copy of the Henderson opinion in his hands. "I came here to speak about humility, scholarship, and the dangers of assuming brilliance wears a particular suit or bears a particular title." He paused, then added, "And to thank the man who taught me that lesson in front of the whole country, and did so with more grace than I deserved." At that moment, the doors at the back of the hall banged. Denzel Washington walked in. No applause, no lights, just nods. Respectful, quiet, earned. A mural went up on the side of the community center in Philly, Not of Denzel's face, but of the Constitution, split down the middle, mended by a line of handwritten text. Justice isn't what you say when you win. It's how you speak when no one expects you to be right. D. Washington. A boy asked his older brother who the quote belonged to. His brother answered, "A lawyer, a real one." And in a small, quiet office in D.C., Denzel sat once more with a legal pad, one hand holding a pen, the other resting on a dog-eared copy of Timms v. Indiana. He wasn't done, because justice, he believed, doesn't end with the last word in a court opinion. It starts with the first name they try to overlook and the voice that refuses to stay silent. If this story moved you, remember, it wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a quiet but powerful stand against bias and assumptions. If you appreciated what you heard, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from the verdict alone. It comes from the people who choose to speak up.